Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so should we start?
Sure.
For some of you, this could be first participation, but I would like to give information about our Aspire project. We're here because of NSF Advance's Aspire project. This is part of our program titled UM Connect. And the primary focus of our STEM launches is providing mentors and mentees participating in the Connect Women Mentoring Women Program, the opportunity to connect with one another and develop professionally. So ASPIRE stands for Adaptations for Sustainable Policies and Increased Recruitment Excellence in Diversity. We adopt evidence-based strategies from other advanced institutions to change the institutional climate at the University of Memphis and advance for STEM women faculty. So we have mentors and mentees for our mentoring program. We continue on this program on the third year, and then hopefully we'll sustain it. So I'll talk a little bit about this program. To be eligible for this program, we have to be a STEM faculty who identifies as an early, mid, or late career, have a desire to advance your career, and be willing to complete an 8-hour virtual self-paced training program spread over the rest of the semester and meet bi-monthly, face-to-face or online during the academic year with a collective peer mentoring group. And the experience is inclusive of bi-monthly meetings with 3 mentees and 1 mentor, as well as 3 STEM luncheons per semester. So we have a first group of mentors and mentees, and we'd like to continue on this in the next couple of years and hopefully sustain it in the university. So now I would like to recognize our today's speaker, Dr. Teri Reed. Dr. Reed is Assistant Vice President of Faculty Research Development for the Office of Research at the University of Cincinnati and professor in the Department of Chemical and Environmental Engineering. She received her BS, Bachelor of Science in Petroleum Engineering from the University of Oklahoma. She spent 7 years in the petroleum industry. Each time she earned her MBA. She subsequently received her PhD in Industrial Engineering from Arizona State University. Dr. Reed's teaching interests include engineering systems, multidisciplinary and introductory engineering, quality engineering, diversity and literature. Her research interests include statistics education, concept inventory development, assessment, evaluation of learning and programs, recruitment and retention, diversity, equity, and cultural unity. She has received funding from the National Science Foundation, Department of Education, and various other foundations and industry. I would like to mention this, it's important. Teri was the 2016 and 17 president of Women in Engineering Proactive Network and currently continues as the immediate past president. She's also a board member and fellow of the American Society of Engineering Education, a distinguished member of the Society of Petroleum Engineers, and a member of the Institute of Electronics and Electrical Engineers. She was elected the Professional Interest Council Chair in 2016 and serving a 3-year term on the ASEE Board of Directors. We have also included the lengthy biography of Dr. Reed, so you can read more about her. Now, I will leave it to Dr. Reed to continue her presentation today, which is life in a fishbowl. Being a goldfish is only one option. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me to come today. And I hope some people don't mind my reference to Ted Lasso, but I will get around to what that means. And if you didn't get to, if Ted Lasso wasn't part of your um, COVID COVID binge watching, I will explain later what that means. So um, I look forward to talking to you. I hope you'll consider it a conversation. So please feel free to let me know if you've got questions or want to discuss as we go along. I'm going to start with one of my favorite quotes that was from Bill Wolfe, or William Wolfe, as he was known professionally. When he was the president of the National Academy of Engineering, it was one of the first quotes that we used actually to even to write a paper that was kind of one of the first of its kind in engineering education, because it was an ethnography about a specific student, Inez. We named her Inez to save her identity. And we actually wrote the paper around Dr. Wolf's discussion of what diversity meant to him, but he did this at the national level. And this was back, unfortunately, back in the 90s. I received some information today from the 60s I'm going to share with you at the end as well, but hopefully we'll think about the timing of things that go along. But this is actually absolutely one of my favorite definitions and discussion points of diversities, this broad terms. And so to continue that, Scott Page, this is an older book of Scott Page's, and hopefully I have the new book, and it's very interesting too, but I still always go back to this one of his older books, this cognitive diversity idea, because it helps us to think about there's so many different perspectives. And I wrote these perspectives later on, like the diverse interpretation, about myself, in that some people, think I work at the University of Cincinnati. To others, I may be mom or a mom. And then to others, I'm a researcher on engineering education. All of these are true, but they're all different interpretations of the world, and different ways people see just me. And then the heuristics. This is where I think it really gets interesting, is because we all have a different way of solving and thinking of these problems. And this is where this idea of cognitive diversity actually, in the research that persons like Scott Page have done, have proven that these diverse teams, as we all, have heard so many times, actually improve, right? So I have a little story that I'm going to now talk about that I love to use in conversations, and I think it's because people, once you hear the story, and some of you probably have already heard it in other venues, it's about those two fish and the frog that swim past them and say, that frog saying, how's the water, to the fish, and the fish look at each other and have no idea what the frog's talking about. And I love this analogy, and it actually came to me. There's a really interesting book, it's becoming dated, called The Invisible Tapestry. But it's about departmental university, and it can be corporate culture as well. But to us, we're very interested in, the department, the college, the university kind of diversity. But this tapestry that we live in, this invisible tapestry, is much like the fish and in their water. So what does that mean for us? What should our water, oops, went one too many. What should our water look like, or what should we notice about our water? So the parable of the fish came from David Foster Wallace. If you haven't read David Foster Wallace, unfortunately we've lost him. He's just passed, but he just has a really interesting way of thinking about that our most obvious and important realities are the hardest ones for us to see and talk about. So this is our water, right? And they are our universal truths. And whenever it's difficult to see these as our universal truths, because it's our culture, and it suspends and envelopes us in a web of shared meaning. But like the fish, we're blind to the assumptions that create the fabric or the meaning of our lives. So often there's it's very difficult, and only a few ways that we can see our water. And one of those ways is to step out of it. So I'm gonna go to, and I joke about this. I was telling somebody about the talk, and I said I should call it the iceberg talk because I've got a lot of icebergs. And I love the analogy, but there's many ways to look at this analogy. There's lots of different icebergs, right? And it's a matter of how do we think what is above our surfaces, what's below our surfaces, and we should remember that there's significantly more below our surfaces, right? That's the whole iceberg kind of thing. There's only so many things that people can see on the outside. So I know some of you are in the room and some of you are eating. So I'm going to ask you to take a moment and move your utensils if you have to. If you're already not using your left hand to eat with, please do so. If you're not eating, hopefully you have a piece of paper or pencil near, because I'd like for you to think about what are your identities and write those down. So if you're not eating, then writing your identities only with your left hand. All right. So the important part of your left of this is that we're going to share. Those are who are willing to share. You won't have to. Just in the room, you might share with each other. Online, you might share with your screen if you're willing. But we're going to look at what we think our identities are. So I'm going to give you just about literally a minute and a half, and I need you to eat with your left hand or write some of your identities with your left hand. And the time starts now.
I kind of like this. It's interactive.
Thirty seconds left. Okay, that's time. So it's fast, I know. How many of you are ate or have eaten or eating with their left hands? Can I can't really tell. But are there several?
Yeah.
Okay. And then how many of you are actually wrote down a few of your as many identities as possible with your left hand? There are a couple, even in the room or online. Yeah. Okay. So how did this go for you? Whichever way you decide. How did writing these things down or eating with your left hand, how did it go for you?
Yeah, it did go well.
Yeah, but that's right, you wrote it with your right hand.
I don't even remember which one I wrote with, to be honest with you. I guess I did it my right hand, yeah. I was thinking it was left hand.
Hi, is your underlying assumption that everybody is right-handed?
No, The
Okay.
left-handed people should have still used their left hand.
Okay.
Is anyone left? Did anyone continue to use your left hand and not find this to be challenging at all? No lefties?
Look at your chat. There is at least one person that said they're left-handed.
Oh, good. Good, good. So how did it go, Anna, as far as being left-handed?
It was okay. The problem is just always try to identify yourself with identities. Just try to be honest and figure out what is the more accurate way to describe yourself. But for the left-handed, that was the thing. I didn't have problem with using the left as my dominant hand.
Yeah, yeah. So how about those of you that are right-handed that were writing with your left? How did that go as far as describing yourself with your identities? Or eating with your left? How did it go when you're right-handed?
Yeah, I cheated, I used my right hand.
It happens. It happens. The other happens too. Every now and then I'll have somebody that's left-handed that thinks I want them to write with their right. I'm like, no, no, no. Today's your day. You get to stay left. So let's talk about the handedness first, and then we're going to talk about our identities. And so the handedness exercise is such an interesting one because it covers so many ideas of this is adapted from a presentation that that's been going, many people do this presentation, but it also demonstrates many concepts related to privilege that we don't always think about. And I can tell you that when I first started doing, this has been many years, the handedness exercise, I tried to buy left-handed scissors. And what I found is everyone sent me right-handed scissors and they were very expensive, mind you. And they would arrive and I'd pull them out and I'm like, they're just right-handed. And I had an assistant at that time that said, oh, no worries, I'm left-handed. We got used to it, right? So this concept of assimilation is very strong in left-handed people because they frequently have to change their behavior, to assimilate and code shifting as well. So we don't, I'm a right-handed person, but I'm unconscious of the benefits that I receive in many, many, many ways until somebody points out to me, or somebody makes it to the table first to sit in a certain way so that they can eat with their left hand. And the awkwardness whenever we try to eat with our left hand is at least give some idea of the benefits that we receive because we're so used to that idea. I know that there's been efforts to think about left-handed people when it comes to car design and things along those lines, but those are more recent, a lot more recent. So it's an unearned privilege for those of us that are righties. And then every now and then I find somebody who tells me and shares that, well, they were actually left, but kind of like I had a left-handed grandmother and she taught me how to iron left-handed, but she wouldn't let me write or do anything else left-handed because she said, oh, it's horrible. There's nothing, nothing for us. You don't want to be this different person, the awkwardness or strangeness. She was very funny about it. And then we also have sometimes people associate it with deviant or dangerous. In some ways, I think it is dangerous because the world is designed so right? So it's an interesting way for us to think about what are some of our privileges. And that's, in a way, also what I was asking you to think about with your water. So would anybody mind sharing some of their identities of their water? Even in the chat, because thank you for reminding me about the chat. I didn't have it open earlier. No one asked me to put the iceberg back up. I often have people say, please, can you put that iceberg back up? I don't, I gotta think about what my identities actually are.
I can go with my identities.
But she can't hear you, Ezra.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
I can go with my identities.
Okay, that'd be great.
The first thing came to my mind was professor. And then I'm a mom of two boys, 14 and 16 years old.
Excuse me, Estra, we cannot hear you well.
Do you hear me well now?
I think it's Mackenzie's computer that's picking up the sound. Or are you logged in both of those?
I'm in both places. If I turn this one on, it will go crazy. It will go crazy with this one.
Ezra, you could always type it in the chat.
I can definitely do that.
So I heard you say professor, mom of two boys.
Okay, so she can hear it. Okay, I'm gonna write to the chat, and then I'm gonna also talk because some of you can hear it. Professor, mom. I'm a barbershop singer. My career ended with COVID. I used to be a member of Memphis City Sound Chorus, all-woman chorus. I'm a lead singer. What else? Lately, I play pickleball. I'm a pickleball player.
It's a hot topic right now. Pickleball's big.
Absolutely. I like to cook. I like Mediterranean cooking, stuffed grape leaves. I don't know, it's tabbouleh salad. I'm Turkish, so I'm originally from Turkey. It's been 27 years in the United States, but I have that Turkish background, and I like to cook. What else?
Well, we can tell that you wrote with your right hand.
I wrote with my right hand, and on top of that, I cheated. So, so I'm not very good with the rules. Seems like. What else? I like to travel. I enjoy traveling. I am an author. I have 4 books. But out of all those 4 books, most of them are textbooks or professional. But I have one children's book that I'm more proud of, and the children's book includes my children, my 2 boys, going to this Wonderland going to Wonderland and looking for this princess. I did not make any money out of this children's book. There is only one review on the internet. Maybe after I mention this, there's going to be more reviews. It's on Amazon. It's called The Bilingual Adventure of Wonderland. What else? I'm into architecture. I'm into mid-century modern buildings. I am part of mid-century modern all these sites. I'm very much interested in architecture. Yeah.
Okay, great. Anyone else like to share? If you wrote with your left hand, you probably don't have so many if you're right-handed. No. Okay, let's keep going. So from here, I'm going to use another fish analogy. And so, does anyone have any idea what happens to a saltwater fish when they're placed in a freshwater pond or, aquarium, anything along those lines? They get sick?
They die.
They die.
Yeah, so this is yet another fish and water analogy, but Dr. Noma Lamwan in 2014 used this analogy for us to think about our students. But I like to use it for us to think about more than just our students. And it's true. They do die. I like that they get sick first and they bloat, and ultimately they die a slow and painful death. So it's not instantaneous, it's slow and painful. And so I'd like to use it as a way for us to think about whenever we have our own water around us, how can we understand other people's water, and how can we create this brackish kind of environment with a water around us so that multiple people not just survive, but how do we create this environment so that we can thrive and others around us can thrive together. And we're going to talk about how to think about this environment a little bit more. So all my little fish analogies. And so often the only way that we can really see our water or our culture around us is to step outside of it, because it's just really hard for us to see while we are in it. So, but I like the idea of having this self-reflection and encouraging people to be self-reflective. Think about your water. Think about what you should do and how to step out of it. Because culture, all that water, and this is a very well-known quote, people use it all the time, but it's amazing to me how often it comes to my mind, because culture really does eat strategy for breakfast. We have lots of strategies, right? In trying to assist or change culture along those lines, usually to assist people in a culture. But culture can eat all that strategy for breakfast. And then what are we left with? What's going to be our experience? And so from there, this is where the Ted Lasso quote comes in. So if you haven't seen Ted Lasso, I apologize, but he in multiple places says, and he says it to one of his players, Sam, as you can see in the quote, and what the happiest animal on earth is. And it's a goldfish, because they have a 10-second memory. So he was trying to encourage Sam to get over something that had happened quickly, right? Let it go kind of thing. That's only one option for us, is to get over things quickly, right? So if we're not necessarily going to be a goldfish, then what are we thinking? What are we doing? So here we are with another iceberg. And actually, I just did a workshop here. I'm at Connected, the ASW's conference on diversity. And we did a whole workshop on Sunday on how to read diversity statements, how to evaluate diversity statements, something that, is a positive thing. We got a lot of people requiring diversity statements, but we don't have a lot of evaluation going on of those statements. So, and part of that is thinking about, what is our organizational culture doing? What is it above the iceberg that we see that is artifacts and policies and things along those? But what is below the iceberg? What are our values? And what are some of the real barriers, the unspoken, I like to call them lore when they're not written down, right? And that keeps us from really trying to think about and change our culture. So this is another view of that iceberg. And I like it because in the example, like evaluating diversity statements, there are a lot of unwritten rules and things that happen whenever we don't write them down. So if we put together an evaluation of a diversity statement, we raise some of those unspoken rules and beliefs and values above the waterline. So I'm very much a proponent of bringing things above the waterline so that they become a practice. And I know I do have beliefs below the waterline. And as we know in several reports that I'm going to talk about here in just a second, we actually don't address a lot with beliefs. And I'm a person who tries not to address too much about beliefs, because I don't think we can change those as readily as we can behaviors. So what are we doing, like diversity statements, to make them a required behavior that we use those in the evaluation of hiring new faculty, for example? what do we learn about people if we raise them above the waterline and we actually have a rubric or a way to evaluate them. So this is an example of where I think we need to move things above the waterline. So back when I was president of the Women in Engineering Proactive Network, we actually had this magazine cover come across our desk, and we were in the middle of an NSF project with the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, their executive director. We called Tom and said, this one's interesting, Tom. Is there a reason that your robots have been altered physically? And he was like, no, I don't, that wasn't part of the story. It wasn't part of the story either. And they actually changed their review process to bring things above the waterline, right, of what would become a magazine cover, but something, obviously very recent. Unfortunately, that same year, we had a first-year design manual at another institution, I will say, and it came to our attention. We just hired a women in engineering director for the mainly targeting students. And one of the young women brought this to the attention of our new director and said, this is in our first year design manual. And we had a conversation with this faculty member, and he said, but it's funny. And we're like, yeah, no, not really. Not to everyone. This isn't funny. But there are times that things are above the waterline and we need to push them back down under the water. So with people understanding that we all take this very differently depending on what our culture is and what our identities are. So something else I've been involved in, I was asked to speak to this committee as the president of the Women in Engineering. If you haven't read this book, I highly recommend the whole report, but you don't have to read the whole thing. Just the summary, which I'm going to go over a little bit today, is so interesting. It starts off with this definition and with sexual coercion and unwanted sexual attention. Those are the things that are, yet again, another iceberg, that are tend to be above the iceberg and get lots of attention, and rightly so. So, but it's mainly what is in the public consciousness. However, we've started now with the gender harassment that's typically below the iceberg. So this is actually a poster that you can print off the National Academy's site that talks about what all happens below that waterline. What are we dealing with? And what they found, and what the report talks about, and what we probably know in a little better than others, is that there can be direct or targeted harassing behaviors directed specifically at an individual, but that ambient, that culture, can also be as harmful whenever people see others being treated in this way. And it's not so genderized either. So it is harmful in both cases, right? We don't want these direct targeted, but just having the water being that ambient culture is also very harmful. And whenever this is kind of those microaggressions that continue to add up, I know you've had a talk about microaggressions and all that just continue to build. Only some of these aren't quite so micro, right? And if it continues over a long period of time, then the negativity can become as serious as isolated instances of sexual coercion. So the report tries to focus on what's below the public consciousness, or that's gender harassment. So in that, the key findings for where sexual harassment is extensive is unfortunately where most of us live. And the things that result is it's the most common by far form of sexual harassment. I'll show you a little bit of data, but it impacts all of us in our research integrity. It changes our talent pool in multiple ways. And this legal compliance idea is just not enough. So we need to think about changing our climate. So this is actual data from the University of Texas system. We've since asked them in an NSF grant I have that looks specifically at civility and harassing behaviors in engineering, technology, and computing. So they further broken this down. But I like to say that these aren't points of pride; they're only facts, and that is what they found, and they report in this report, is that academia is second only to the military. And within academia, engineering is second only to medicine. And I always say those are not points of pride, but just facts of the data. Now, this is student data. They find the same thing in faculty and staff data. But notice that the sexual coercion and unwanted sexual attention, the things above the waterline, are 1% and 2%, right? Notice also that so the gender harassment, the things below, crude behavior, sexist hostility, those are below the waterline, but occur at a much higher rate. And not just for persons who, and then unfortunately this language we now have changed, instead of female, male, we talk about people who identify as men and women, but not just for women, but also men. And so it's something that I think some people are surprised to see, but it is something that's absolutely a part of why. So, but in addition to this, we also found in the study that women of color, they experience it far worse than white women, white men, and men of color. And it's mainly because it includes also the racial harassment in addition to sexual harassment. So this is where we get to the civility idea. And we're about to release a civility paper from the Action Collaborative that came out of this work that I can't wait for people to actually read. Because what can we do about civility? What type of training and things are we able to learn from the literature, and what can we do in our future? The second finding also is that sexual and gender minority people experience sexual harassment much greater than heterosexual women do as well. So these are our identities, right, in our water. And what we see is that people who we may or may not identify in those identities, they are experiencing things significantly different. So findings are the impact on targets and bystanders. It undermines our women's professional and educational attainment and our mental and physical health. And it's not only an impact on direct targets, but the ambient and the indirect targets, the entire organization. And the cumulative effect essentially adds up, right? And so the recommendation is that we should consider sexual harassment equally as important in research misconduct in terms of its effect on the integrity of research. Very interesting finding, and actually very difficult to find, even though NSF, NIH, Department of Defense, they've all started asking for reporting along these lines, and there are outcomes, there are consequences related to that. So what are predictors? These aren't surprising, and they absolutely describe academia as well as some other environments as well. And whenever we see it as tolerated, then we really, these are the indicators of tolerating. If you feel that reporting is risky, it's not going to be taken seriously, and that people get away with it, even if they are found that they in fact have done this. So there's great work that talk about this from the National Academy. Again, this is one of the websites, so you can see these types of things, and they have these recommendations. So essentially, these are the key recommendations that come out of it. Things that you all are doing by transferring from the advanced grants, like hiring promotion steps. Now, the civility promotion, that's part of what we're working on, trying to get information out. How do we promote civility? And then being interruptive, being an upstander. What I like to say, they use the language of bystander in the report, but what we actually need are upstanders. We don't need that people standing back and saying something later. We actually need people saying something now. And we need all kinds of people saying something now. Right? And so that upstanding becomes a very interesting part of our defense and what we should be working. And then training to change behavior. Notice it's not about changing beliefs. This is that what's above and below the waterline again. It's only about behaviors. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had about people saying, well, you know, the belief is, and I said, that's fine, but the behavior, the expectation of the behavior in this environment, that's what we're talking about today. And I often have people go, oh, well, I haven't really thought about separating those two. It's like you have to separate those two. So there's also the mentoring networks, things that you are doing, and independent research funding. We're all working to create opportunities of independent research fund. This especially with traineeships, graduate students, whenever they can't get away from an advisor. And if you haven't seen Picture a Scientist yet as a documentary, I highly recommend it, because there is a lot about independent research funding and why we should be doing that as a policy. And then supports for targets. We have various ways of supporting targets. And then ultimately we're working to try to prevent retaliation. I would say that we've got a long way to go here as well, because we need to be thinking about more what the social justice aspect, what does the target need in order to, and I'm not certain that they could resume a normal life, but in order to come back from being a target individual. And that's something that we're still working to do. And then transparency and accountability, these clear policies. We've added a civility statement, as you'll see here in a minute. There are things that I think bring those things above the waterline, right? They have to be clear. What are the ramifications of these things? And what should we be doing? And then what are indicators of these things, like assessing? I know you all do climate surveys. So what are you going to do with that information? What are we doing with that information at all our institutions? So, and then leadership skills and how to bring our leaders in and developing their skills, because it's not the easiest thing in the world to talk about, as we know. So this is the Action Collaborative. We happen to be a member of it at the University of Cincinnati. There are 62 institutions that are currently members. So we get early access. They're about to change the model, and I would encourage people to check out what they have. They've got lots of good information. That was kind of the goal, is to pull what are people doing through the Action Collaborative. So this is an example. We actually did a student survey in engineering, and unfortunately it was right as COVID hit, and the response rate is too small. But it did get us started to looking at, because we have a lot of people who say, oh, that this just doesn't happen here. It's not prevalent. It's not, persistent. I love that word. I'm like, could you define persistent for me? But what we did find is that it actually is prevalent in larger percents. We're a co-op mandated school, required school. And to be honest with you, when we first did this work, we thought we were going to see that companies had a very interesting thing going on if they had training. But it ends up, it's not so much the company personnel where our students go. It's actually their co-op partners, the fellow students. That is, if we thought about it a little bit longer, maybe we'd come to that. And then what happens is it starts on co-op and then it comes back to campus and continues. So it's a real thing. Most of our students, said that they ignored it. They treated it as a joke. And unfortunately, we saw it also our faculty and staff. It was a little bit higher than we anticipated in our faculty and staff, unfortunately. And so it's not just about our students as well. It's not just about, we actually did experiential learning in classrooms as well as in co-ops or research labs. We compared the two, and there's actually prevalence in both. So what we have to think about is work, for example, on, I like to say, on cultural humility. And so my slides are looping for some reason, so I apologize. But there are these levels, and there's actually an instrument that measures this. And it's interesting. I actually, had a workshop here at Connected that talked about, for as much as we know about students, no one is really doing research on faculty, staff in some of these areas. And this intercultural sensitivity is one of those. But what we find is that from denial, where, you know, the language is like, oh, it doesn't exist, to others, to polarization, it's otherness, right? To minimization, oh, it's all good, right? In the end, we're all really just the same. You know, there's no acceptance that of neutrality as a given state. And then ultimately adaptation, which there's actually a lot of controversy that whether you can actually get to adaptation. Notice this is not assimilation. This is adaptation. So there's lots of controversy on this, but this was actually one of my PhD students when I was at Purdue that did this work on first year students. They actually called us from the IDI instrument and said, what is your population? Because we've never seen this difference between their perceived orientation, that's the high side on this scale, versus it has more white space, in case the blue doesn't work for you, it has more white space in the scale, to their actual developmental orientation. That split is very large. And like I said, these are students, and we know almost nothing about the faculty that on something like this on the same scale. So within WePan again, this is a different graduate student who found this scale. We've adapted it. It was from the Simmons Center for Gender and Organizations. And what we find is that there are 4 frames to look at things. And I think in the frames now all the time, almost everything I do, I think of, well, what frame would I put that in? Each of these frames is necessary, but not sufficient. And unfortunately, that frame 1 is where we end up in a lot of spaces, like our women in engineering programs. And it is about minimizing differences, but equipping the undergrad, the women, to deal with the environment, right? So we give them support and help. And it's interesting because what we want to talk about are the pros and cons of each, and I apologize. That first frame operates from a women as deficit model, which does help minimize differences in experience and give support, which we need. So don't get me wrong about this. We need these things. But on the con side, differences aren't good. And these equipping or like fixing the women like they need to be fixed, right? We've heard this before. And that leads to negativity. I have a really good friend, Jackie Sullivan. She talks about this all the time, that in multiple surveys she'd have young men say, well, why would I want to work with a young woman? There's something obviously wrong with them. They have a whole office for them. So that's the con for equipping the women. And that's, so each of these necessary but not equivalent, but they have pros and cons. These are the policies creating the equal playing field, HEED policy and law kind of things. And these can help us remove structural barriers, but they do create resentment. You've heard resentment before, and often are a Band-Aid and don't necessarily lead to ultimate life, long-term change. Now, what's interesting is that we think we really want people to value differences and diversity, and we do, right? And so the pro is, it eliminates those differences, but it can be a con in that it makes everyone, and it leads to stereotype. It universalizes women's experiences, and it can reinforce some of these stereotypes. So this is the difference. Difference is good, but when we point out those differences, we have these issues as well. But ultimately, the frog in the water with the fish, what we need to do is think about re-envisioning our culture. And this gets us back to our water, right? Can we set up our environments where we actually do think everyone can be successful, and then facilitate and promote this success? So I liked, this is one area that we targeted students, but we can do the same thing with faculty and staff. But We need to equip the students, enforce our policy and laws. We need to embrace our differences and then evolve the organizational culture, right? And there's many programs that are working toward doing this. And a lot of them come from the advanced grants, and like the Men as Advocates and Allies. I love that program. I gave it the presidential award whenever I was WEPAN president, because what are these actionable plans? What can we actually do to get us there, right? So one of my favorite things is diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusion is actually being asked to dance. And so I challenge you, who's dancing at your party? And do they feel welcome to dance? So back to our water and stepping outside of it. And then I'll share with you that this exercise actually started in a first-year engineering classroom, and it starts a really nice example that handedness gives them an idea of how to think about themselves, perhaps in a different way, have some self-reflection. So essentially, we want to move from upstander but to active bystander training, and it's common on your campus. You should look for it to see where it exists and for what populations, your students, your faculty, staff. And then the whole idea of vocabulary is so important. This, I know you've already done implicit bias, but I'm always fascinated what year people come into these types of articles. But we've been doing the implicit bias project. If you haven't gone out and looked at the Harvard implicit bias and done your biases, I actually have a slightly negative bias toward women in science. And I'm like, I know better, right? But I still have that. That's part of who we are. We can't get rid of our biases completely. We can only reflect on them and create mechanisms to hopefully reduce them, at least be aware of them. Pronouns. I am always amazed when everything I just night before last, I had a meeting with our industrial engineering faculty, and I said, okay, I'm going to have to stop you. But can it ever be a she? Can we just use a neutral pronoun even, and instead of always being a he? But names and titles also matter. So thinking about where we're using those kinds of things. So what else? I mentioned the Male Advocates and Allies. I think this is a great program. We've started it at University of Cincinnati. There's a bunch of institutions who have been doing this. It's from Advance and a very positive means. We have tools like interviewing department heads that came from WEPAN. Deans and department heads all had to be interviewed using this tool. I think it's a really important, this is actually a diversity statement kind of evaluation. And we used it just recently on our provost search. I did go and look up, and University of Memphis is a member of the ASEE Dean's Pledge. Congratulations. And then also they have worked, and we just gave the awards last night to new institutions who are just named that have this recognized institutions in the ASEE Diversity Recognition Program, working to make things above the waterline, right? That's our goal. So you all were recognized in the 21 time period. We have meeting attendees, and if you had come in on my Zoom, you would actually be seeing my waiting room that says, if you come into my Zoom waiting room, I expect this commitment from you to the principles of diversity. This was exerted from a NASM policy, and not many people realize that when you're in the Zoom waiting room, you can actually put things, besides sending messages. I've had people, when I did an ABET accreditation visit, say, I took a picture of your waiting room. Can I use that at my institution? I'm like, oh yeah, you just scored points. Yes, you can do that. And I think that's a really cool way to make things very visible. This is our college civility statement, which we put many places, including in our first year teaming documents. So how do we change things? Rochelle Reisberg had a great work about key factors, the things we need to change, and actions. We need to identify champions, things that you're doing, especially male advocates, for us, that implicit association, that implicit Harvard. If you haven't, like I said, if you haven't done it, you'll be shocked. I encourage people to go check for themselves, have your own self-reflection. And then these are things at the schools and department levels for actions as well. Commit to hiring, promoting, things that you're doing in the advanced program, but we need to raise them up most likely to a higher level. So I appreciate you're allowing me to celebrate. Oh, I didn't change the title. I apologize. But this is, I hope that you have happy dancing and that people are dancing at your party. I was going to share, I have resources and they have these slides that I'm happy to share with everyone. But I got this in a meeting this morning. This is from 1965, a letter from a husband, or a letter that was given to a husband. But this second paragraph is the individual who posted this actually on Twitter was the son. And the whole second paragraph is about the man's wife in 1965. And the stories on Twitter were about how we still see this today. So unfortunately, we may not have as many artifacts that look like this, but we're not too far away from it. So we all have to continue striving and wondering who is actually welcome at our party. So thanks for having me today. And I enjoyed getting to meet you all, and I'm happy to answer questions. I know the time's almost out. So but please contact me on email if you'd like as well.